G'day, Ancient Mahar here. Just to talk a little bit about what happens to people who are in toxic, unhealthy relationships with abusive, trauma-bonded betrayals. It's a key central aspect of why it is especially difficult for people to actually leave the relationship or not want to try again, any form of toxic relationship, not stay in contact, these things that aren't healthy for people after toxic and abusive relationships. Whether you're with somebody or you were with somebody who had borderline personality or narcissistic personality, or perhaps other diagnoses or other kind of mental health challenges that create a lot of difficulty in interpersonal relationships. And just remember, BPD and NPD are not one and the same for more people than not diagnosed with BPD. What is it that is so difficult for people to extricate themselves, and not only extricate themselves from these relationships if the other person, the toxic individual, doesn't sort of, end the relationship and just like you're stuck with that right there. And even then, people go on to continue to suffer and to have hope and to try to get back with a person. But it is codependency, and it is something specific within what really, I'm not saying all codependency is toxic, but there's an element of toxic codependency that drives a codependent freeze response to the abuse, to the difficulties in the relationship, the ups and the downs, the being blamed, the going around in circles, their triggered emotional dysregulation, or anybody's in any toxic kind of relationship. But the thing is, this codependent response of freeze has all to do with toxic guilt. And sometimes toxic guilt, more to the point, is driven by toxic shame. And this goes to the reality that the seeds of codependency are sown in childhood in many various ways, in many different kinds of families of origin. For some people, parents are pretty decent parents, but something happens emotionally that plants those seeds of codependency. Maybe your parents are arguing and fighting a lot, but they're not, they don't treat you poorly. They take care of most of your needs. But say you're think about it. Were you 4, 5, 6 years old, your parents are fighting, and you felt like you needed to be the peacemaker or the hero or the rescuer? Because what happens to kids in those circumstances in their childhoods is that if mom or dad don't feel safe, like if mom's crying all the time, or if dad's really upset a lot of time, because it depends, all these relationships can include various different issues that a parent might have, or one parent having one thing and another parent having something that commiserately, rather unfortunately, in a betrayal bond or a trauma bond type of relationship, quote, fits together, unquote, but not really. And so children feeling if parents are fighting, kids get scared. They want it to stop. They want it to go away. Why? Because it interrupts your emotional safety as a child. And then when people grow up, and some people have more adversity to deal with than what I'm describing here in their childhoods, but not to the same extent usually as those who will develop certain other mental health challenges. But the point is, so people grow up and, they just do their best to keep moving forward in their lives. And they believe that their childhoods were pretty good, and maybe they were pretty good, except for there were some things that happened that threatened your emotional safety, that led you to have a shame wound that isn't your fault. Parents don't do it on purpose. It depends. They don't do it on purpose, but many people with reasonable parents, this can still happen for various different reasons. So they leave you with a shame wound, and you grow up and you're it might affect your self-esteem. Maybe you don't have the highest self-esteem. Maybe you have a bit of low self-worth, but you're getting on with your life and things are going pretty okay. And then it isn't until people get into toxic relationships and go through that toxic dynamic and abuse and losing themselves and all what happens, that then all of a sudden it's like, well, yeah, people get shattered and devastated and they're so hurt. And if you got the seeds of codependency in your childhood, then you're going to be trying to give. Codependency is an unhealthy relational style unto itself, okay? Not to say that it's not as severe an unhealthy relational style or way of relating as those with BPD. Due to trauma or adverse experience in childhood, codependency is about a wounded inner child, and that means that you're not an integrated self in that sense, because a part of yourself is still wounded and hurt from maybe a long time ago, can be deep within your unconscious. So for people with codependency, there is a dysfunctional, unhealthy relationship to and with self that needs to be healed, that was always there, but that's made inherently worse and more painful, and in many people's cases much more obvious to their consciousness by having had a relationship with a person with BPD or NPD. So there's this toxic element to codependency, toxic codependency, that produces this freeze response in people to adverse experience. Like if you're being abused, if you're traumatized, if it's a trauma-bonded relationship and you don't realize that yet, what makes it extra difficult to extricate yourself from a relationship? What makes it really hard to go no contact is that you're having a codependency freeze response, which likely you also had in childhood, when maybe it was just a case of you didn't feel emotionally safe here and there, which is still hard for kids though, and impacting and can plant the seeds of codependency. So this leads a lot of people with codependency to continue to try to make things work. And the other thing is that many people who have had some intermittent reinforcement or some intermittent difficulty or lack of safety or various other things in their childhoods grow up and kind of push that away and think they're okay, is until they get into a toxic relationship they realize, wait a minute, and maybe not then, but when you seek help, you can find that out, right, about your own life, and you think, well, my childhood was great, and maybe all in all it was pretty okay, but there will be some things in there from your childhood, some experiences, wounded inner child, that you've been able to grow up and carry on your life in many other ways. But in these relationships, your wounded inner child definitely gets, for lack of a better way to put it, triggered. So there's this codependency freeze response of toxic shame, and that drives toxic guilt. And then it's that over concern, because people with codependency are externalizing out a lot too. It's that over concern of, well, it must be my fault. Or if only I could have said this or done this or not done this or not said that. But then, even when maybe and you're still really hurting that this relationship can't work out, this freeze response stops people from going no contact when they really need to. It's this, but what about them? I'm worried about him or her and I'll feel so bad. That's where the toxic shame kicks in. Because shame, when a person is a child, when you were a child, if you were shamed at all, and this can happen without parents doing it intentionally or with malice or anything, when any human being is a child and there's any modicum of shame, then it isn't like you did something bad. You feel like you are bad. So the toxic shame kicks in, and then you feel like I'm gonna be the bad person. They're gonna think I'm a horrible person. I've had so many clients say to me, "That's not me. That's not who I am," and they're speaking about shame wounds, and they're in a codependent freeze response, and they just think that's who they are. Well, I just want to tell you today, it's not who you are. You need to know more about who you actually are. And the other thing is that this toxic shame, people have shame wounds in childhood. Lots of people have shame wounds that might not get them into these relationships and these difficulties. But the other thing is, then you feel the toxic guilt. Toxic shame and toxic guilt and the toxic codependency aspect of the codependency freeze response, when falling into toxic shame and toxic guilt, it's all toxic. Why? Because it's not your guilt, or it's not related to that relationship breakup. It might go back to your childhood, but it's not your fault. But that shame wound or that toxic shame and toxic guilt that you feel, you might have felt as a child, and this might be repeating for you. But it is not something that is actually what is the accurate picture. Because in these toxic relationships, you have a role, and you're part of a dynamic or the trauma bond, But the thing is, it's not your fault. And so, though you will overextend yourself, and though as a codependent you will externalize things about yourself, or externalize things without realizing it consciously, that you need as you give and enable and rescue and all of that, the shame and the guilt either come from your childhood, but they still weren't yours or your fault, and or you're feeling it, refeeling it again in the relationship, or you were, and you are now after a relationship breakup in a toxic, abusive relationship, and it's not yours. So that goes along with the cognitive dissonance. It goes along with the emotional dissonance. It goes along with all the reasons why it's so difficult for people with codependency to be able to find their way through navigating what they themselves really need to know more about, what you yourself might need to know more about. And even if you know it all up here, you got to get it into your emotional landscape. And you need to do some healing from the past as well as now, or the previous, or the just ended relationship, or the on and off again relationship. So it's really important to know that you can't help people that present you with impossible relational dynamics and toxic relationships. Can't save them, can't rescue them, can't fix them. And you're sacrificing yourself, and you're abandoning yourself in a way that to one degree or another you were abandoned in your childhood. Doesn't mean you were literally abandoned or whatever, but there are moments of when parents can't meet emotional needs, or emotional safety is compromised for a child at any age and stage going through childhood up until adolescence, especially in the early years though, like in even 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is where the wounding of the inner child that you go on and live beyond until you encounter this kind of dynamic, that you go on, but there's this wound left from your childhood. So this is why this is so complicated, along with the no closure, right, from people that present this trauma-bonded, toxic dynamic of a relationship, unbeknownst to people in the beginning. So it's important to think about that. I'm out here to work with you if you resonate with me. Recovery after these type of relationships and from codependency is a multi-layered, and not often for most people. It's really not a short-term thing. It doesn't happen in 4 months or 6 months. People get much better. But this reason why people are so ensconced, or can't get out of putting other people's feelings ahead of their own, and the response of toxic shame and toxic guilt leaves people really feeling like they can't go no contact either, can't take care of themselves. You keep missing the person. You're identifying with an abuser. And for some people that replicates. You might have had a parent in your life that was like that. But lots of people didn't have a parent quite like that. But there's still something you experienced in your childhood that you need to know more about, so that you can heal at that level as well as heal from the relationship. But in order to do all of that, and that work in healing and recovery, it's really difficult when you can't go no contact, or you keep going on and off in these relationships. So I hope that's helpful to people, gives you food for thought. And like I said, if you resonate with me, You can just go to ajmahari.ca, click on the button Sessions with AJ. It'll explain everything. And if you'd like to work with me, then I'm out here to work with you. So your choice, of course. But I hope this was helpful, because there's so much to the depth and the multi-layered reality of what's happening to people when they're getting hurt and abused and traumatized, and then trying to navigate that when it's over and no closure, and all this cognitive dissonance, the freeze response, the feeling toxic shame and toxic guilt. It's so painful for people, it shatters people. And it also renders people really unable in many cases to do anything but obsess on the person. For some people, it's a long, long time. People don't eat well. People don't do what they used to do. Friends don't understand. Family might understand. They might love you and care about you, but they don't get it if they haven't been through it. And you really need to seek help, because there's so many parts to this that people can learn so much up here about, but not get into your emotional landscape. And it's going to keep you stuck in this huge dilemma of the cognitive dissonance and emotional dissonance, among other things, where you're looking for closure or you want to get them back. But there's just, what's not on the landscape for so many people is how to look at the fact that something is ended, and or that you really needed it to end, even if you ended it or you didn't end it. But then why do people continue to just obsessively think about these people or the ex, and just continue to proliferate your own suffering on top of what someone else has caused you, and that multi-layered what it goes back to in your childhood? Take care.